Trauma and Crisis intervention today, and I'm just going to add to what's already been talked about in this PowerPoint. So, trauma. Vicarious trauma is the process of change that happens because you care about other people who've been hurt and feel committed or responsible to help them. Over time, this process can lead to changes in your psychological, physical, and spiritual well being. These can be sexual trauma, physical trauma, emotional abuse, anything like that that you hear about in your work. Cumulative and ongoing. Vicarious trauma is an ongoing process of change over time that results from witnessing or hearing other people's suffering and need. So, as much as we've been trained to let these things go, some things you just can't drop, unfortunately. Burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma. Burnout is a physical or emotional exhaustion, especially as a result of long-term stress. It doesn't have to be that long-term. Keep in mind that burnout can happen quickly. Compassion fatigue is a state of tension and preoccupation with individuals or cumulative trauma of clients. So this happens often when you relate to someone. So if you are working with people who have Alzheimer's and then you have a family member who has Alzheimer's, you might see those people in the people you work with, and therefore this might happen more often or more easily. Vicarious trauma, the transformation or change in a helper's inner experience as a result of responsibility for an empathetic engagement with traumatized clients. Vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout. They're very, very similar. Some people use them interchangeably. And it can impact people in the following ways. So your coping mechanisms become overwhelmed and maybe just cease to work in general. The effectiveness as a caregiver is reduced. You may be unable to do your job. Feeling helpless. Detached from coworkers not involved in the work. Detachment from because you feel like they don't understand. They wouldn't understand. Detachment from family and friends. Same idea. Shortened tenure as a service provider, so you may be too overwhelmed and decide that you need to leave that job. You might feel like it's not for you. Vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, burnout can negatively affect your work, your colleagues, the overall functioning of the organization, and the quality of assistance being provided to those you're working to help. So I work in the Springs, and one of the major places down here that people receive mental health has a lot of turnover, and it's really frustrating for clients who go there because they're having to explain themselves over and over. Well, it's because the workers are just overworked and they get burnt out really quickly, and it's really unfortunate. So, having employers that try to combat that by utilizing self-care, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So let's see, they influence the way you act and interact with people you love. This affects your family and friends, absolutely. And going back a little bit, so when you take things home and you unload on other people, so I like to think of vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout like you are overwhelmed. Your bucket is full of other people's stuff and you have to get rid of it in some way, or it just breaks you down. And so a lot of people find that they turn to their spouse or someone close to them or another social worker they know and unload on them, and when really that's not helping. It's helping you in the short term, but in the long term it really just affects your relationships negatively. So, like I said, we're going to talk about self-care and how to deal with that, and maybe the proper place for things like that, which would be in supervision or something to that effect. So, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, burnout. These terms are often used interchangeably. Also, they can look the same, but they mean different things. And because they mean different things, they can be treated differently. And finally, they can all look a little bit like PTSD. Absolutely. Symptoms of PTSD are the feelings of fear, hopelessness, anger, rage, horror, sleep disturbances, changes in memory, difficulty concentrating, difficulty maintaining boundaries. And PTSD, that's something that you would seek treatment for. So it's the same as if you were seeking treatment for PTSD. You have to take care of yourself in order to prevent those things from happening, and also to make their effects last short term. Defining burnout. Burnout is a state of emotional, mental, and physical exhaustion caused by excessive and prolonged stress. It occurs when you feel overwhelmed and unable to meet constant demands. As the stress continues, you begin to lose the interest or motivation that led you to take a certain role in the first place. You think, why did I do this? Why did I start working as a social worker? It's so hard, and it takes such a toll on me. Why did I do this? And you'll find that there's reasons that you did it, and you have to really find those again, and you have to take care of yourself in a way that allows you to continue to be the social worker that you want to be. Burnout can happen with any job. It's so true. Anything that I'm sure you can think of a job that you've had in the past that caused you burnout. Compassion fatigue is a feeling of deep sympathy and sorrow for another who is stricken by suffering or misfortune, accompanied by a strong desire to alleviate the pain or remove its cause. Um, so, compassion fatigue is a problem for counselors and can limit their effectiveness. So, compassion fatigue is a little bit different than the other two, and it happens over time, and it's it's another one of those that's really difficult to overcome, but totally possible with the proper guidance. Before vicarious trauma comes secondary trauma, the stress resulting from helping or wanting to help a traumatized or suffering person. This can occur with any professional working with victims of trauma. This means lawyers, judges, court staff, or interpreters. So let's see. It's you getting traumatized by hearing other people's trauma. So for instance, there was people that were watching the Nasser trial, and I'm not sure if you know what that is, but it's a doctor who assaulted and victimized hundreds of young girls that he worked with, and the whole trial was on TV, and you could hear these girls explaining in detail their trauma and what he did to them. And there was a lot of people who were traumatized by hearing about the trauma that the girls suffered. And so that's the Nasser trial. And then when you're not expecting something, for instance, I had a patient who came to see me one week, and she was just rekindling her relationship with her daughter, who was in her mid-20s. Well, the next week she came in and said her daughter passed away. I was not prepared for that at all, and it really, really threw me. And I had to compose myself real quick and then make sure that I talked with, the person that I utilized for supervision afterward, because it was traumatizing that she was going through this and was so dysregulated, and it took a lot out of me to try to help her. And so definitely had some experiences of vicarious trauma there. So, vicarious trauma, the cumulative transformative effects of working with survivors of traumatic life events. Vicarious trauma is a natural reaction resulting from exposure to experiences and feelings of traumatic event experienced by another person. This is much more serious than burnout or compassion fatigue, because you're feeling the trauma like it was your own, except obviously that it's not. But it's not direct trauma, but it's caused by second-hand exposure, accrual of exposure to other people's trauma. But specifically, if trauma affects you in a if a specific trauma affects you in a certain way, it's very important to seek help right away. Vicarious trauma happens more often when you can identify with the person that you um, are seeing and talking about the trauma. For instance, well, the example that I gave you, I'm not a mother to a 26-year-old, but I can imagine the pain of losing a young child that you were just starting to get to know again, after years of not being around that child and not having a relationship with that child. So, another thing, what are results of vicarious trauma? But I think this is more like what is vicarious trauma, and it's a gradual process that may unfold over time. It may happen instantly, it may happen later when you see that person's name again come up on your schedule. Cumulative effect of contact with survivors of violence or disaster or other trauma. Vicarious trauma happens because a person cares. You have to have empathy in order to feel vicarious trauma. An individual feels committed or responsible to help and at times cannot help. It's, feeling helpless, not being able to actually do the thing that you set out to do, and that's help another human. Common signs: difficulty managing your emotions, difficulty accepting or feeling okay about yourself, difficulty making good decisions, problems managing the boundaries between yourself and others, so taking too much responsibility, having difficulty leaving work at the end of the day, trying to step in and control others' lives. Um, so taking too much responsibility. You don't have to be the person who you're working for. You don't have to be their everything. You need to be able to refer out if you have to. You need to leave at the end of the day on time to take care of yourself. So it can also cause sleeping problems, nightmares, intrusive thoughts, starting to sound like PTSD again. Hypervigilance, general anxiety and anxiety attacks, isolation and disconnection, substance abuse and high risk behaviors, changes in appetite and sex drive, irritability and depression, cynicism, negativity, and apathy about life and the world. This is happening to one person. It can happen to me or anyone. Those are the thoughts. So the people that are most at risk for vicarious trauma tend to avoid problems or difficult feelings, blame others for their difficulties, withdraw from others when things get hard, have experienced trauma themselves, lack connection with a source of meaning, purpose, and hope, have stress in multiple areas of life. These are people who are more susceptible. And can you identify with any of these things? Like I said earlier, I think almost everyone can identify with burnout, and people who are trying to, let's see, everyone working with traumatized people can identify the signs in other people, at least, if not in yourself. And so how can we combat it? And that's where self-care comes in. So what does self-care mean to you? It means something different to everybody. It should address the whole person, physically, emotionally, behaviorally, spiritually, and include stress-reducing activities in which you are regularly and habitually engaged. It's important to make it a habit, to make things a habit for you. Self-care: know your own triggers and warning signs. Be alert to what you expose yourself to outside of work. Set boundaries. Add variety to your work. Maintain your relationships outside of work. Build self-care into your routine at work and at home. Exercise. Be aware of unhealthy coping strategies. Are you going home and having a few drinks every night? That might not be the healthiest way to cope. I really recommend having a routine to turn yourself off from work. So some people like to take their badge at the end of the day and hang it up on their rear view mirror or in a certain place at home. And that symbolizes putting it away for the day until you put that thing on the next day. That's just an example, but you can make up your own. What to do with burnout? The easiest to address. So burnout is the easiest to address. It's why you get a vacation and why that is required in Colorado. Use the 3R approach: recognize, reverse, resilience. Watch for the warning.